Hello, welcome to a session titled Journalism, Bleep, Fake News, Bleep, and Disinformation. How to Equip Journalism for the Fightback is the subtitle. We are here today to do a worldwide industry launch of this handbook with the title that I just mentioned, which was published by UNESCO and commissioned by UNESCO and edited with my colleague Sherilyn Ayrton from the World Editors Forum, who very sadly can't be here. I know she wishes she could be, and she's following online. And we have a stunning group of women. I'd just like to say this is an all-women panel about disinformation that is also global. And I should probably tell you who I am, since I'm speaking at you like I know you, because I feel very at home in Perugia. My name's Julie Posetti. I'm Senior Research Fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. I want to introduce the people around me here. You probably don't need me to introduce Maria Ressa, who is a long-time collaborator and colleague and friend, but also, most importantly, the cover of Time magazine, most importantly in terms of what she represents as somebody struggling for all of us in the context of the disinformation wars that we are confronting. So Maria needs no further introduction. Inga Thordar on my left, who's not quite as famous as Maria, so I'm going to give her an introduction. She's very important too, though. She's the digital editor for CNN International, has a stellar long career. And speaking as somebody from CNN is going to be able to talk to us about what it's like to be in the line of fire as an organisation targeted by Donald Trump. And to my right is Shoma Basu, who edits and is the founder of a website called ReporterAtLarge. She has just finished a project as a Reuters Institute journalist fellow, and she has the first findings of that project, which was an investigative journalism undercover project in WhatsApp groups in India, to share with us today. So this is pretty extraordinary stuff that is fascinating to watch as an expression of the kind of journalism that can be done to combat disinformation. So we're going to start with me talking to you a little bit about this handbook, but I'll be as brief as I can be because other than to say that it's freely available online, and it's also free in hard copy, but unfortunately the only books I have are not the same. But I did write this one, so you can have this one as well, which has some tangentially connected issues around digital security and protecting sources in the context of attacks on journalists. But this handbook, which, as I say, is available for free online, was commissioned by UNESCO, and we have a stellar cast of contributors to this handbook, which is very practical. It sets out some of the theory and context, and then it goes into lessons and resources and tools to help you deal with the problem. So Guy Berger, who's the Director of Freedom of Expression at UNESCO, commissioned this book, wrote the foreword. Claire Wardle, who'll be very familiar to many of you, who with Hossein Durakshan, are you here, Hossein? Did you make it to this session? No. I was going to make him come up if he was here, who wrote the chapter on their pretty seminal piece of work around definitions of disinformation. Magda Abu Fadil, who is a Middle East media literacy specialist. Alexios Mantsalis, who many of you will know previously with the International Fact-Checking Network at Pointer. Tom Truenard and Fergus Bell, who wrote a great chapter on verification and as it's applied to the social and visual web, and Alexios, of course, being a world expert in fact-checking, focused on that. So this was commissioned in the context of increasing concerns internationally around geopolitics and disinformation. And the concern was not just about the ways in which, as Maria would say, some various issues were being weaponized in part through orchestrated disinformation campaigns, but also because of the possibilities to target now in new ways, in viral ways, in specific ways, unwitting recipients and distributors of disinformation. And journalists are not just involved in a very pivotal role as potentially unwitting distributors of misinformation, but also as targets. So they're increasingly targeted, as we've heard in various places during this conference. They're targeted, particularly women journalists, for really vicious state trolling, online harassment, cyber misogyny, whatever you want to describe it as. And they're targeted as a way of trying to chill their participation, to force them off the web, but also to silence them in terms of their reporting. And they're targeted in a variety of ways, including through not just harassment and threats of sexual violence, but also through attacks like doxing, for example, so with an attempt to get access to their information, to discredit them. Deep fakes, Rana Ayub is in this book as a case study, has talked already at this conference about her experiences. But most importantly, journalism is the most essential tool we have, I think, in society to combat effectively what we are dealing with here. And so what I want to start by saying is that if you were to sort of ask what are the findings of this handbook, or what are the key principles that we're trying to put into place, and how does that relate to journalism, the first one is this idea, and you've heard many people talk about mission-driven journalism here, the need to double down on what we do, what is essential about journalism, quality ethical journalism. We need to understand what Claire and Hossein defined as information disorder. We need to improve our fact-checking and digital verification practices, but we also need innovative approaches to storytelling about disinformation and ways of engaging audiences in the fight back. And the final point there is around really deep understanding and skills to deal with digital defence in reference to the disinformation crisis, particularly in the context of deep fakes. So in this handbook, we begin with Cheryl and Ayrton connecting trust, and we just had an interesting panel that I unfortunately didn't hear the entirety of, debating the connections between trust and fact-checking and verification. Cheryl delves into those themes. A companion study to this handbook was published by the International Centre for Journalists, ICFJ, just before this book came out. It's a useful guide if you're a journalist looking for a timeline, which this provides, about the history of disinformation and propaganda. Then I recommend this to you, also free and available online, because contextual historical understanding of what we're dealing with, I think, is a really important issue. So the key concepts, this is the first draft, or Claire Waddle and Hussein Direction definition of misinformation, distinguishing it from disinformation, and they've coined a term malinformation, which is as to be understood as sort of maliciously motivated misinformation or disinformation, so shared with malicious intent. Claire also is renowned for leading a campaign to get journalism, journalists and civil society actors and governments to stop using the term fake news because it's extremely problematic. And we've used it wherever we've used it in this handbook. It's unavoidable insofar as it might be with reference to quotes, and it's in reference to a particular kind of manipulation of disinformation. So that's a really important point to note. There's a chapter on just understanding how we got into this situation, so looking at digital disruption, the social media revolution, which is still, you know, the tools that we have at our disposal as digital journalists and news organisations are fundamental to our capacity to connect with audiences and to do contemporary journalism, but they have caused, along with the business model challenges, gaps in our practice and risks associated with disinformation. We talk about the need to develop media literacy and information literacy that's suitable for the digital environment, that goes beyond just knowledge about news and the ability to critique news, which is how it's often taught in schools, to equipping audiences in a really proactive way and making them collaborators in the processes of verification and fact-checking. We also, as I said, have this great, really great practical chapter from Alexios Mansalis, where he goes through a system of really colour coding information to figure out, at what level you should be concerned about content and how you might respond to it. And Alexios makes the point that, as journalists in particular, we're targeted by purveyors of disinformation because they can discredit us by getting us, of course, to share misinformation or disinformation. This need to, going beyond Google reverse image search, there are many tools and techniques, and I'd just point you again to First Draft, which many of you will be familiar with already, which is a brilliant organisation founded by Claire and her sister Jenny Sargent, which is doing great work in trying to partner with news organisations and equip them. And Fergus Bell talks here about the need to adapt our fact-checking and verification skills to a digital environment. He's doing really interesting work collaborating with journalism schools and trying to get ground-up kind of transformation of skills and on projects that are collaborative. And most importantly, learning how to respond when you or your sources are targeted in disinformation campaigns. So when journalists are attacked, as we've heard here, this handbook goes through case studies involving journalists, most of them women, in South Africa, in the Philippines, in India. A Finnish journalist called Jessica Aro, who was brutally trolled very early in our kind of awareness around disinformation by Russian trolls. She says, she reports, and she has recently won a court case to restrain two of the people she tracked down through her journalism as being responsible for that campaign. So this is what we're trying to do, is to provide skills and knowledge that you can use not just in your own work, but to transfer to your communities and also to your colleagues. So as I say, it's free to download, both that and the companion History of Disinformation and Propaganda are free to download. So I'm going to stop talking about that now, other than to say I have only one proof copy with me, and whoever asks the most entertaining question or most pertinent question, I'll decide, can have that copy. I also have, inadvertently, copies of Protecting Journalism Sources in the Digital Age available, which does go into the issues around, to an extent, online harassment, but digital security. So I'm going to start with you, Maria Ressa, because not only are you a case study, you're much more than a case study, of course, but you are a case study in this handbook. But you're here because of the 2016 and thereafter experience of being in a news organisation that was founded and born on social media, that was prolifically targeted by what we now would refer to as state trolling. Can you just firstly tell us how, in the initial phase, you attempted to combat that, and what you've learned along the way? Big question, but
I'm going to try to compress everything, because this feels like the obsession of my life recently. I think the first part, we lived on social media, so we actually saw the weaponization happen after elections. So I was actually very happy when Mayor Duterte was using social media and seemed to be using it quite well. It was the first time that Facebook was used to win an election, right? But the weaponization happened in July of 2016. By August, we were just alarmed, because by July 2016, there was anger during the campaign. There were attacks against that media oligarchs, the same things that you see in other parts of the world. But in July of 2016, it turned into hate and inciting to hate. And the first people targeted were anyone who questioned the drug war. Not coincidentally, the drug war began July 2016. So we were very naive, and I thought, I started wondering why people started becoming quiet on social media. So in August, we launched a campaign called #NoPlaceForHate. You see how naive. #NoPlaceForHate. Boy, were we clobbered. Like, we had no idea. And at that point, that was when the first week of that, we started to collect data. That was really when, something weird is going on. Can we figure out? That was when we found 26 accounts that were very dubious. They all followed each other. And then we began to put it on Excel sheets. And because we're journalists, not tech people, it took 3 months to manually count how many other accounts those 26 accounts influenced. 3 million. It was 3 million, almost 3 million accounts, and that took over 2.5 months to do. So by August, end of August, we had the data. And I gave that to Facebook. I don't think Facebook knew really what was happening, but around, I remembered meeting with 3 different folks, and it was in Singapore. I said, this is really alarming. Look at what's happening in the Philippines, and you've got elections coming up in the United States. And then, as a joke, I said, Trump could win. I don't know if you guys remember, in August... No, you're not laughing. But in August of 2016, it didn't seem like Trump would win at that point, right? And so, of course, I gave the data, and then after Trump won, they asked me for the data again. I think, what are my lessons learned? Number 1, you have to identify the problem, and you have to be on solid ground. And to be on solid ground, you have to be on solid ground because you're going to be attacked. And to be on solid ground, you need the data. And so for us, I wouldn't have been as strong in fighting back if I did not have the data. The data was so clear, and we presented this. By the time I held back the story, because I wanted Facebook first to fix it, number 1. But number 2, I wanted them to have a statement with it. When we didn't have it, we came out with the story, and 3 parts. And then you've heard me say this, we were clobbered, even worse, because that entire propaganda machine focused on us. And I know what that feels like. 90 hate messages per hour. 90 hate messages per hour for a while. Anyway, so you got to identify the problem. You have to have the data. No one will believe you. That's the other part. In August, September, October 2016, no one really believed us. We identified the problem. We had the data. Then the third step was we got to tell other news heads, which is what we did. We have a gathering called Media Nation. In October of 2016, I did a very similar presentation that you saw me give last night, and I said, look, here is the data. And then the largest news groups kind of said, pshaw, we're not on social media, we have real power. That was pshaw. Later, a year later, we're all together now. We all work together. We have a group where we collaborate, which is the second point. So first, identify the problem. Be very clear with data. 2, collaborate. And then 3, if you are only doing it on your own, you'll be attacked. So when you go out and tell your communities, do the stories, you must collaborate in the stories. We're still in the process of doing this. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, but the communities are the targets, right? If you think about it this way, society is the target. And if we had never done those stories, they would have been blindsided. The manipulation would have continued with impunity. As it was, we bore the brunt of doing that story. Don't journalists always feel like you go do the story and then you get pounded? But I think that's the state of where we are. Now, after Mark Zuckerberg appears in Congress, in the US Congress, all of a sudden it was like, okay. When I listened to what he had to say, it's like, okay, been there, done that, we've survived it, we're moving on. You have to go, to me now, our problem is have to go beyond fact-checking to finding the networks that spread the lies, helping push to make sure people understand those networks. And for me, I think globally, we need to look at how those networks can be made accountable, taken down, and then finding who's behind them and making them accountable.
Great, thanks, Maria. I mean, something you just said there reminded me, we say truth is the first casualty of war, but perhaps journalists are the second. You can see the way in which this comes together. Inga, I'm going to come to you next, because for one of the reasons being that Maria, experienced this crisis first in the Philippines. It's not to say that it was happening, it wasn't happening elsewhere, but it became evident in terms of its connection to democracy and the maintenance of open societies in 2016 around the election of Rodrigo Duterte. Soon afterwards, Donald Trump was elected, and CNN was labelled within months fake news by Donald Trump. Can you just talk us through what it was like to find your news organisation in a Western liberal democracy pilloried and targeted in that manner by somebody who holds one of the most important roles internationally?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a very interesting times, and I don't think we're quite out of that yet. I mean, I work in London, and we used to sort of half-heartedly joke about the fact that the mornings in London was the quiet time before, Trump woke up. And then about lunchtime in London, it all kicked off again, and we all waited for that first tweet. And there were definitely days when he would literally start with tweets about whatever he was watching on morning shows in the US, and CNN, obviously a frequent target of that. And fake news basically became his term for news he didn't like. And he didn't like a lot of what we were doing. And I mean, I think the reason for that was that we were fact-checking what he was saying. We were checking, every time that he said something that was inaccurate, we were calling it out. We did that on all our platforms. And so therefore, that became, he tweeted that out very regularly as something that he called fake news. It's, of course, worrying when journalism becomes a target of powerful men like that, and how you sort of deal with it. But I feel like actually what it did for us at CNN is that we became even more determined, more, heartened that, we had to continue doing good journalism. We had to try to ignore the storm that was being created around it and think eventually, people will respond to, fact-checking, to the good journalism that we do, to the rigorous process that we have around everything that we do. And I mean, actually, CNN, I think, is one of the organizations that fact-checks everything ourselves. We don't rely on agencies. We will make the calls to whatever it is, on whatever story it is. And, if that means that we're a little bit behind everyone else, that's okay, because we believe that it's important that when CNN says it, that's the truth, and that's what we've checked ourselves to the best of our absolute ability and from primary sources. So we have gone through a very rigorous process of how we conduct our journalism, how we, package it up before we put it out. And I think that, if anything, those attacks have made us even more determined to continue to do that.
To be more rigorous even still.
Yeah, and not to give up.
Determination is a constant theme. We're going to have a bit of a conversation in a minute, but I want to come now to Shoma. Can you share with us, I know you've got a presentation, so we need to switch back, thank you, to the PowerPoint. Can you share with us what you found through this project, which involved you going undercover, under supervision, undercover, to investigate what you're referring to as troll networks in the context of a country where we have seen this sort of disinformation fueled often via WhatsApp spill over into real life consequences, which include lynchings and mobbings and murders. And coming up to an election in India, of course, this makes the job of a journalist in terms of investigative work and reporting generally so much more difficult and challenging. So tell us what you learned, Shoma.
I'm really excited about this project, so please tell me if I go too fast. Well, this story came out a little while, I think, in 2018, early 2018. This is the BJP, which is the ruling party, BJP president, who says, real or fake, we can make any message go viral. His name is Amit Shah, and he's speaking to the social media volunteers. And I don't know if you, if you've read about it, but the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the ruling party in India, it has this entire army, a very, organized army, the troll armies, we can call them a troll army, and they are basically, two tiers. So there is a clear distinction between composer of messages and sharers of messages. And then it happens through a lot like chain marketing, So there would be a handful of people sitting right inside the BJP headquarters, the party headquarters in New Delhi, composing the messages in a very nice language, very convincing language, and which in a very emotional, which is kind of, will make you think or make you do something like that. And then they are kind of, those messages are shared across groups. So, yeah, and this story was, this is the story how Modi, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, and Shah turned a women's NGO into a secret election propaganda machine. The story came out just yesterday, this investigative piece. And I'm sure you all have heard about the lynch mobs in India. Anyway, so from 2009 to 2018, there have been 281 hate crimes, and 58% of them have been against Muslims and 15% against other minority groups. The year Narendra Modi came to power, 2014, there was there was this increase in the number of hate crimes. So from 2009 to 2014, there were probably around 20 to 25, and then the numbers increased quite a lot. And when we are talking about, when I started this project, I was really interested in WhatsApp, because on Facebook and Twitter, the posts are open to public, they are open to public. These are public posts, so they are open to public censor. But WhatsApp is encrypted. And the credibility of the sender, all the messages have credibility of the sender attached to them, even if, there's this forward tag on the top of the message. There are 600 million internet users in India. There's 74% of literacy rate. And when we talk about 74% literacy rate, it's primary education, not higher education. We have 200 million WhatsApp users in India. That's the data from 2017. And in 2018, Jio Mobile, which is, a business, a project by Reliance Industries, it came out in 2018, in which they released these $10 low-cost transitional handsets. So basically, this 200 million number is probably quite a lot now. It has increased, but there's not been any recent surveys. And 1/6 of the member of a group, 1/6 of people are member of a group started by a political party or a leader. So to understand, what kind of communal hate was being circulated in all these groups, I joined various political parties. So I joined 2 groups by Aam Aadmi Party, Samajwadi Party, Bahujan Samajwadi Party, etc. I joined 80, I looked at data from 80 Congress group, which is, the opposition party, and 140 BJP groups. And all these are recognized national and state political parties, not fringe groups. I collected data from November 14 to February 21st, 2019. 140 WhatsApp groups by BJP. Why? Because communal hatred was only found in BJP. So anti-Hindu messages were not there at all in these mainstream groups. It was all Islamophobic hate speech. There were total more than 60,000 messages. I cleaned the data set by deleting pornographic links and product marketing links, and so I was left with 20,641. And then of that, text messages were 7,351. And after analyzing them, after categorizing them in 4 categories, 1 propaganda, 2 conspiracy theories, anti-Muslim, and general. So this is how, 24% of all the messages were illegal hate speech, Islamophobia. So these are some of the, kind of messages that you see in the groups. And these are long messages. Some of the messages were 1,500 words long or 2,000 words long. And they say, they start with the man who divided India in pieces in the name of religion, the Jinnah was a Muslim, or the sultans who shed the blood of thousands of Hindus were Muslim. And and then really graphic videos. These videos are mainly from Iraq or Syria. Real videos, but shared with the messages. basically to put the point across that, if Muslims become a majority in India, then this is what is going to happen to Hindus. Then, on February 14th, 2019, Pulwama attack happened, a terrorist attack in Jammu and Kashmir in which 44 paramilitary personnel were killed. And there was this sudden spike of hate messages. A lot of fact-checking agencies said that this was unprecedented and they've never seen, so much of disinformation and fake messages before. So I did a separate analysis of the 7-day data in which, you can see how, the messages kept on increasing as we neared the election. The election started on 11th April in India. And after categorizing them, I found 41% of those messages were inflammatory. And then 36% was propaganda, and 23% was conspiracy theories. And of the 41% messages that I'm talking about, I further categorized them in these 3 categories. So 24% were against Kashmiris, and there have been more than 40 attacks all over India against Kashmiri people, Kashmiri businessmen, Kashmiri students. 33% were against Muslims, and this bigger portion, 44% were anti-nationals. Now, when I say anti-national, what exactly do I mean is, there is this narrative in India that that Muslims are a threat. Anybody supporting, and Muslims are equal to terrorism. Anybody supporting Muslims are, supporters of terrorism. So, and they include, journalists, civil society members, lawyers, human rights lawyers. So all this hate, all the hate messages were targeting this. 44% section is, the hate messages being targeted towards journalists, where their phone numbers were shared in these WhatsApp groups. And then they were called up, and the call recordings were posted again on the WhatsApp groups, encouraging other members of the groups to call them up and harass them. Now, this is one interesting piece of information that I wanted to share with you, how Facebook's fact-checkers, after this Pulwama attack, 3 out of 7 partners of Facebook's fact-checking initiative were found sharing misinformation. And these are the main narratives, that Hindus are under threat. So if you go to Twitter, you'll find Hindu khatre mein hai. This is the particular hashtag. Then Hindus becoming a minority in India. Muslims will kill Hindus to take over India. Muslims will rape Hindu women. Muslims are sexually aggressive because they eat beef. Again, beef equals to mother. So you see, all those cow protected, those cow lynchings because, you got to protect your mother, even though women rights are not really cared about in India. All Muslims are Pakistanis. All Muslims are terrorists. Then again, on the night of Pulwama, the terrorist attack, this hashtag was trending on Twitter, terrorism has religion. Non-BJP parties are anti-Hindu, and non-BJP parties support terrorism. So these are the main narratives. Now, you see a lot of this, trickling down into common people, how people have actually started believing in these things, and there have been innumerable psychological studies and experiments about how false memories are implanted by sustained exposure to dominant text and images. And this is a tried and tested, propaganda method. What Adolf Hitler did with radio, our leaders are doing with social media now. So you see here, somebody rejecting, refusing to speak to a Muslim call center representative, or somebody, canceling car app. Ola is equivalent to Uber in India. So Ola cab because the driver was Muslim. And again, this is again very recent, on March 24th, 2019, just 25 men over a very minor dispute over cricket, they just barged into a Muslim home and they beat up the family brutally, and they all said that go back to Pakistan. So
you're seeing a correlation,
yes, exactly,
between the disinformation, hate-inspired, flowing over into the world.
Exactly. So now, people, Hindus don't really need the excuse that, Muslims are eating beef, so we kill them or we lynch them. They can just, there is complete impunity because in India there have been members of parliaments, elected members of, legislative assemblies who have welcomed lynchers with garlands, and, they've facilitated them, they've given them election tickets, and there's this kind of, there's complete impunity and also supporting these people, the lynchers.
A fever almost, isn't
exactly.
it? Thanks, Shoma, very much. So that's original research still in motion. Shoma is preparing to publish that. Eventually, the Reuters Institute will publish a report based on her research, but she is also publishing journalistically in the near future. And I asked her to share that with us because it's one way, one creative way, that research-informed investigative journalism can really deal with this problem and elaborate on understanding. So thank you for sharing that with us, Shoma. I want to come to the people in the audience who are probably fading after a long day. It's quite warm in here, very soon. But first, can I get you, Maria, to tell me, I know you told me earlier that this handbook is being used in places in the Philippines. Can you just give us an understanding of how that's happening and what role that sort of education can play?
About a year and a half ago, journalists from different news organizations in the Philippines. So we couldn't get all the news groups to agree, but the end goal was to bring the major news groups together. So the key journalists in each news group came together. We created a group. What did we call it? D&D, Democracy and Disinformation. And we got funding as a group. One guy started a draft of funding to do workshops. And as a whole, we organized ourselves so that we would do 10 workshops at least once a month that would go from school to school, that would include civic society and NGOs as well as students. And one of the things, when this was finally published, we standardized some of our presentations, but then we started using the UNESCO book. It helps, it begins, because one of the things that you begin to realize that when you live on social media the way Filipinos do, that I forget to tell you, Filipinos spend the most time on the internet, even though our internet is horrendously slow, and we spend the most time on social media. This is Hootsuite. That you have. We Are Social came out with this January 2019 report. So even though through all of that, what we found when we have gatherings like this is that kids don't know what to do with the lies. They don't know how to defend themselves when they're attacked. So the workshops are very real. They tackle their problems, and then we talk about how we can turn it around and turn it for good. I haven't given up on it because I saw its power. Rappler couldn't have been Rappler without it. We were doing...
The internet, you mean? The social web.
Yes.
I mean, the handbook, I wasn't sure.
No, but I mean, Rappler couldn't have grown without Facebook. I guess this is...
Yeah.
You've heard me talk a lot about what Facebook has done wrong. I think it's already realized, they'll call it unintended consequences, and now there is movement moving forward. And I talk about how there have been 3 takedowns in the Philippines, 1 major takedown in Indonesia. The last takedown in the Philippines, which happened last Friday, took down the social media accounts connected with the guy who headed the campaign of Mayor Duterte. And it took down his personal account. And one step, they named him, just the same way they named the Pakistani military in the takedown they just did last week as well. Name, shame, it moves into social media as well. So, education.
Education, yeah. So so just to clarify, when you say kids, do you mean young reporters, do you mean student journalists, or actual kids in schools? Because you do a lot of, not Quint, that's in India, Rappler does a lot of really great work in community education, sort of media literacy projects within schools as well.
Both.
Yeah.
I mean, we've started working with high school students. We were starting at college level students, but then, you realize they go online when they're much younger, and there is no educational program to actually help them through it. That was the beginning of Rappler when we were starting. We started with college. Now we're going down towards high school, and we were working with the Department of Education up until this administration where, we stopped, or they pushed us out, but thankfully have kept the programs we've put in place.
Great. Inga, you're at CNN. We've established that. We know that CNN journalists and outlets have been targeted, sometimes with threats, including threats that have crossed over into the physical realm. How do you try and equip your staff to deal with these issues? especially given, I've heard even other media organisations, including very large public broadcasters from within Europe, suggesting that the problem with CNN being declared fake news is connected to the kind of journalism that's being produced. In other words, because you take an activist or advocacy stance around disinformation, for example, calling a lie, there's an accusation that it's a bit problematic to fight back in that way. But this is all about the fight back. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first sort of feeling is that it's interesting when calling a lie is an advocacy stand. Yes, isn't that just? That's just what I guess we at CNN would call facts first. So I mean, in terms of how we equip our journalists, I mean, it is really interesting. I mean, those of us who have been at this game for a long time, when we learned journalism, it was about shorthand, about interview techniques, about investigative sort of skill sets and methods and stuff. Studying journalism now has just become more complicated. You're certainly in the verification world, and you have to understand, even if you're doing interviews, you have to check every fact that you're told. When you're being sent a video, is that a deep fake video? Is it, real? I mean, it's become an increasingly complicated. So I think that, equipping people with that kind of information like your handbook gives is incredibly helpful. And I hope that anyone who's been doing journalism, even if they've been doing it for a while, has a look at that and has a think about it. So, I mean, I guess what we've done is that we've definitely gone through our procedures. We've looked at, are we being rigorous enough as we go through it? We've put our staff through sort of additional training and additional understanding of what we need to do. And we have, at CNN, we have departments, which is sort of one of them is the sort of fact-checking department. And we sent out to them anything that we are in any doubt about or any big issues that we're dealing with. It then goes to what we call standards, which is sort of like, is this something that CNN should be doing or dealing with? And they help us out. And obviously then there's the legal issue, if there's any problems with it. So any big stories we do will go through what is internally strangely called the triad. But it is to secure that, the journalism and the journalist has the support of CNN as a whole to make sure that our anything that we put out is perfectly ironclad. And I think it's important for all journalists to understand that this is something that we have to start taking incredibly seriously, and that and I think that for me, I found the work that Claire and Hossein have been doing around labeling what is what. What is misinformation, what is disinformation, and then what is fake news, the actual real term for fake news. And understanding that, the spectrum that we live on is hugely helpful. And I really also want to stress that, CNN got this, was targeted with that term by Trump and some of his supporters, but it really wasn't that universal. I mean, you could see that it was a certain group and mainly sort of driven by him. But, it wasn't a universal term that was used for CNN, which I think speaks to the sort of quality journalism that was done at the time.
Yeah, I think that is important in and of itself, what you just did, which was to explain incredibly rigorous processes of verification, fact-checking, and ethics and policy as well. That's the triangle that you described, or the triad, when you compare that with what some small local newsrooms are struggling to do as sort of one-person operations, for example, it's an awful lot of rigour that's shared within a group. So I'm wondering if part of what we need to do is to tell stories about how we deal with disinformation, how we actually report, and I know there's, for a long time, many people at this conference and others have discussed the importance of transparency and bringing audiences into our news practices and processes to understand what it is that we're trying to do. Yeah.
I mean, I can give an example of that. We have definitely become a lot more transparent, mainly because we want to. I mean, it's nobody's sort of forcing us into things, but we've become a lot more transparent about how we get our journalism. I think sort of one recent example is when Stone was arrested in the States as part of the Mueller inquiry. This was in January. CNN had a camera outside his house, and we had a big discussion with the editors. We said we had it there because we had been given, we'd done a lot of work. We had sources in a few places, and we had actually been doing weeks of work. And this wasn't sort of us just driving past the house and he just happened to be arrested at the time. We had actually invested in investigation around this, in sources and other things that, led us to think that this might possibly be happening. And what we did is that we wrote a news story about it. We wrote a news story explaining why CNN was there when it happened. Mainly just that there would be no misunderstanding about us being in any, working with any of the parties to this, either Stone or Mueller inquiry, and just being very open about what was happening. And I do think that that is very important, especially on sensitive stories like that.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, do we have questions or comments, maybe challenges, a particular issue that you're struggling to deal with in your context? There's a hand right here. Do we have a microphone? And tell us who you are and who you want to answer the question, because we've only got 10 minutes left. So.
Yeah, hi, I'm Heidi Schezet. I'm a Norwegian journalist. It's very interesting to listen to, so thank you to all of you. I'm wondering, the problem of disinformation, the reason it's so efficient, also the reason why accusations of fake news by the president is working is because there's a very low amount of trust in the media, particularly in the US. I don't know how it is in India and the Philippines. I would like to know. But I'm wondering if you have changed, I guess this is to CNN, why is it so low, and are you doing anything to try to increase trust, apart from showing how you ended up outside Stone's house, for example?
Who did you want to answer that?
CNN, but it would be interesting to hear reflections, if there is time, from the other participants.
Sorry, I'm going to do a little bit of journalism here. Nick, how low is the trust in the US in media? I can't remember what the figure is. 38%. Okay. Thank you.
See, that's collaboration. Yeah. We like that. Yes, it is very worrying that there is that the trust in media is low. But I don't think that there is anything that we should do differently apart from what we're doing right now. If we continue to do the best stories, if we continue to go after what we think is important, if we continue to fact check them really well, if we continue to scrutinize both our own work as well as the what is in front of us. You have to hope that trust goes up and that the trust in certain institutions will go up. And I do think that there's definitely a brand issue there as well. And to Julie's point, smaller organizations don't have the resources that CNN probably has to go through that rigorous sort of process. But a lot of great journalism is being done right now. Fantastic journalism by many outlets. And and I think it's in many ways despite all the crisis we're going through, we're living through a time when a golden era of journalism in many ways. So I think that we have to recognize that as well and just stay the course and continue to do what we do best. That's what I would say. Maria.
I think quickly, this is the result of so many years. In the United States, it's a special case, and I'm going to go from CNN to Fox. There's a book written by Yochai Benkler, who looked at, the part of the erosion of trust. A lot of the disinformation was also seeded, was amplified by media. That's a unique situation, and I was there when Fox was formed. I was with CNN at that point. It is, in many ways, what we in television used to call, I'm no longer in television, what television used to call the hook, right? When we used to have 3 seconds to be able to capture your attention, social media took much, much further. And what happened with social media is like termites being unleashed on a wooden floor, which is the foundation of trust, right? And even though you only see little things, it's eating it away. And that trust can collapse and has collapsed in many parts of the world. But it's been used by power to gain power. So this is not something that, you know, media did to itself. Sometimes we do. We make mistakes, yes. But in general, standards and ethics hold that now it's a new time because of that. So that's the only thing I would say. Termites eating the wood. And then here's the last part, and this is personal to me. Hearing President Duterte call me a criminal 1,000,000 times makes me a criminal in the eyes of many Filipinos, and I've done nothing wrong but be a journalist.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's most galling. And so then you turn your tools onto the problem, which you continue to do with eloquence and determination, which I think is why people feel so inspired. Does anyone have a question for Shoma? If not, I'm going to ask her to respond as well, because we're going to get pushed out of here in a little bit. Yep. You have a question for Shoma, or you're going to make it a question for Shoma? Nice tactic.
Anyone that can answer me. Basically, we are student journalists from Malta. We came for this convention together. I wanted to ask, what is your advice for us students to not fall in the trap of fake news, even just for an assignment or just a thesis? But what is your advice?
Do you want to? Okay, I'll give you some advice, and then I might ask a question of Shoma, and then we have to wrap up. I think it goes to what Inga referred to before. We can't assume that just because you are young and digitally savvy and digitally born, as we sometimes say, that you are going to be able to navigate these digital tools and platforms and apps in a way that applies the skills of journalism. So it's about linking those two things up. The first thing I would say, I mean, you know, other than trying through a process of collaboration and trying to self-educate as much as you can to try and join those dots, and that's what this handbook tries to do, I would say that you don't want to be cynical, but you must be skeptical. I mean, I was a journalism educator for 10 years, so this is an old statement. It's about applying that core principle of skepticism and determination to do forensic verification. You know, do I know this? How do I know this? Before I share, I mean, it's that, for me, the one thing that I bring to this, which has been an early discovery around how to manage social media lives for journalists, for me, was as a former broadcaster with the ABC in Australia, one thing I was taught was, you know, we have, you should take a deep breath before, if you're in doubt, if you're about to say something that you feel is potentially problematic, whether that's legally or otherwise, apply that 7-second rule that is often applied in broadcasting contexts where you have a dump button. So you're often in delay for 7 seconds as a broadcaster. In case something goes wrong, they can hit a button and basically you're back to real time. So pause, wait for 7 seconds after you see something before you share it, and be really connected to your mission. Even if you are in a private WhatsApp group, do you actually redistribute gossip? I know, you know, this is tempting, but this is my reaction to that. Shoma, just I want to finish. I'm surprised they're not literally behind me going, you need to get out. But can you just tell us what you learned through this? Really, I know I was supervising Shoma's project, but she basically did this independently, and it was intense. And I mean, you went into these groups as an undercover reporter. What did you learn through that process about doing this kind of journalism?
Well, as Maria, you know, very rightly said, you repeat a lie 100 times, it becomes a truth. And that's exactly, you know, how people don't really realize how they are endorsing false news. There's so much of noise nowadays, you know, the news, the fake news, the disinformation, misinformation, fact-checking, everything. There's so much of noise around people nowadays that people have also started rejecting certain kind of news, you know. So they've become they are putting these walls around themselves, making themselves completely immune to right news. If you tell them that this is right, they just won't believe you. So it's a big problem now.
So it's a bit of a struggle, and I hope it's not a losing battle. But that's kind of...
No, I've been kicked out of so many WhatsApp groups. You know, if people sharing fake images, and if I tell them that, you know, in my college WhatsApp groups, those personal WhatsApp groups. So if I tell them that they you know, this is like a fake video, and they would say, "You're an anti-national. You don't speak." So
this is something that I'm just going to do a plug here, and a nice segue from that. This is something that journalists in South Africa, where I was recently doing research for the Reuters Institute, pointed out as well. They said they were getting exhausted within their personal networks, within WhatsApp groups, within Facebook Messenger, and in more public spaces, dealing with their family and friends around disinformation and misinformation. But they were so committed to the process that they were persisting. And the plug is that tomorrow at 10 o'clock, I'm launching the next report in the project that I run at the Reuters Institute, which is called the Journalism Innovation Project. And I'm pivoting, as we like to say, innovation, and I'm examining how Rappler in the Philippines, how the Daily Maverick in South Africa, and how the Quint in India are responding innovatively, it's very hard to say, and creatively through mission-driven journalism to the disinformation crisis. So these are real case studies. I spent a month with these guys, travelling and being with them, and learned an enormous amount. So please come tomorrow at 10 o'clock to hear about those case studies. Thank you so much. Go forth and defend